being gay, lesbian, transsexual, and anything else except male and female in African countries dying each and every 2 weeks because of their sexuality, there's a need for change, and the West needs to act. Because they have the power, because they have the resources, and because they have the influence, right? So under the motion that's already on the board, for a few definitions, we define Western nations as the first world, countries in Europe and North America, countries like the US, France, and the UK. And we define conditional aid as humanitarian aid that is based on certain criteria. So you only receive aid on certain criteria. And mostly this aid is medical equipment, financial help, food, water, as well as military assistance in most cases. When we talk about gay rights, we say today we don't only focus on homosexuals, we talk about lesbians, we don't only focus on gays, we talk about lesbians, transsexuals, because they themselves in these countries are not protected by law, so we think they fit the criteria of being anything else except male and female. We talk about their rights as basic rights, since has access to this aid when it gets to these countries, being given the choice to choose their sexuality and making it legal to be gay. So in conclusion of this definition, what proposition means is we would never give aid to African countries if they do not enshrine gay rights in their constitutions and if they do not legally protect gay people, right? So we'll prove two things to you in today's debate. Firstly, that one, it is okay to conditionalize aid because of the nature of Western countries. Two, that they have the moral responsibility and practical ability to conditionalize aid. And three, that, like a wise man told me, principles are quite hollow without application. So we'll prove to you that it does create change. And even if it's marginal, we think we like change. And it's just something they don't achieve in their policy. So we'll prove this through the following points in our case. But firstly, it's morally justified. Secondly, it works towards formal change, which is better. And thirdly, that the current situation is failing human rights and why therefore should aid never be conditionalized, right? So our first idea, which is this idea of why it's morally justified. So here I'm going to give you 7 levels of why we can conditionalize aid. And the first one is aid in itself and in its nature is always being conditional. It has always been conditionalized, especially by Western countries. We've seen this in the Cold War, where America gave the Marshall Aid and Marshall Plan and Truman Plan conditioned on whether or not you become a communist country. So in history, already aid was conditionalized. But we tell you that even now aid is conditionalized. When America and the New World Order started organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, they conditionalized that aid as well through austerity measures and making sure that you do certain things in order to get that aid. So we think nature of aid in itself is conditional. But the biggest question is, why should we conditionalize it on gay rights? And we'd say the first reason is because of the New World Order. We tell you that Western countries have started organizations such as the UN, which stands for human rights, regardless of whether or not those human rights are the rights of majorities or minorities. We think already they have a mandate to assure that they stand for what these organizations stand for. But secondly, we tell you that it's within self-interest of these countries and preferential procurement. We think it's within a country's right and sovereign right to choose who they give their resources to and how they give their resources to and why this is done. So we think because of this and because of the sovereign right to choose who you give your resources to, already they have a right to conditionalize this aid, and already they have the opportunity to do this. But then we tell you that fourthly, they have this responsibility because they have the right not to fund and fuel governments that abuse human rights. So they have the moral responsibility not to give aid to countries that abuse human rights, not to fund them, and not to keep them in the financial capability seat to carry on abusing rights. That in itself is a responsibility. But lastly, they have the responsibility not to be truistic. We think it's very hypocritical to preach rights and then allow people and fund people to abuse rights. We think it's in their responsibility as countries to stand what they say they stand for and practically prove that, right? But lastly, which is the 7th idea, it's within their mandate to take these countries and create change. So one would say aid is not their responsibility, it's not mandatory, it's by choice. So if they do come up here and give you all the harms to the ground, we'd say these harms are the responsibility of government. And if government is given the option to take aid or change rights or change gay rights or not take aid, we think if if they want to blame someone, they should blame the government of these countries. Because it's not America's fault that they don't want to associate with themselves with people that abuse rights. They should blame governments in these countries for not wanting to recognize rights. So these harms that might come, we think it shouldn't be on this aid, it shouldn't be on the West, it should be on the governments that fail and that are hard to knock and to tell that they should change their laws. So we've given you 7 reasons why it is okay to conditionalize aid. But why particularly gay rights? Why particularly this? And we tell you that one, it's more than gay people that are affected by aid not reaching. And we'll tell you that it's gays, lesbians, and transsexuals. And you can imagine that these people have families, right? And we think their families themselves don't receive aid because it's either one, your father is told that he was incapable of giving birth to a child that is normal. So already they ostracize in society, already they don't receive aid. So it's gay people and their families. Already that makes 50% of the country. That means 50% people are not receiving aid. So what does this mean? It means aid is given to these governments, but people on the ground, people who need it, don't receive it because they ostracize, because they discriminated against, because they shunned to death. So already we've proven that there's a need to conditionalize it. And secondly, we've proven that current aid doesn't help people because people don't receive it because of their sexuality. So we think that in itself creates a need, right? But then secondly, we tell you that gay rights are really important because we don't think it's fair for a person to have received basic stability and basic human rights on the basis of their sexuality, something they didn't choose for themselves. We don't think it's fair to make someone starve because they sleep with the same sex. We don't think it's morally justified. So in and itself, we don't think these countries have a reason to disconsider gay rights, to disconsider being gay. So we've told you, one, that it should be conditional because it's within the countries of the West, it's within the sovereign rights of the West. But secondly, we've told you that it's more than just gay people that are affected. More than gay people are affected, so we need to act. So technically, we're talking about half of the population, and we think we need to act in that regard. Yes, sir.
Is the idea of gay acceptance more important than the lives of people who need help?
Thank you, sir. And we'll show you why. Because these people need help, they will accept. And I'll tell you this, I'll tell you POI in my second idea, right? So now we've proven the moral justification, right? Let's show you the practical reason why we should do this. So the second question is it okay to use aid as a tool of influence? We tell you yes because of economic dependence. And we tell you yes, these countries are economically dependent on the West. And we think that's the reason why they're gonna change. We think if your economy is gonna fail without this aid, we think if people are gonna starve without this aid, you are forced to make it legal, you are forced to put it in your constitution. And we think not all countries are stubborn in Zimbabwe. We've seen South Africa being able to change their laws because they felt that people on the ground were going to be hurt. So we think in terms of government, they will have a cost-benefit analysis and they will make it legal. So because they are economically dependent, they will change legally. But let's tell you why legal change is greater than nothing and is good. We'll tell you that legal change, ladies and gentlemen, creates what we call formal change. It means not only do we change the constitution, but it means when gay people are abused and are shunned to death, they can go and report and they have legislative backing, which is something they don't have now. It means the courts, it means the judicial system is able to hold people that harm these individuals accountable for their actions, which is something that doesn't exist in their policy. We think LGBT groups are allowed to come out. These people are allowed to be represented more than just representing themselves, which is something that's better in their situation. And in terms of people changing their mentalities, we think they do. We think culture is not stagnant. We've seen it with circumcision in South Africa, where Western doctors help now, where people in the West can help. But lastly, we think if you were to prioritize food over, if you...
Is it like urgent?
How urgent is it?
I was just going up to the table. If it's okay with you.
Thank you very much for the speech. I would like to welcome the opening speaker of the opposition side to introduce their case.
Ladies and gentlemen, is it justifiable that children growing up in developing countries are held responsible for the culture of its parents? Is it fair if this child is starving that we shouldn't help it? We don't think so, which is why we stand proud to oppose the motion that this House believes Western nations should make aid conditional on advances in gay rights. And before I go into our contentions, I'd like to rebut some of the things that just came from side proposition. So first of all, they had like two basic ideas. The first idea was that somehow this is justifiable, which was just a bunch of assertions of how these people act. And the second one is how the legislature is going to change, how the changes will like become a reality if we somehow stop giving these countries aid. So under the first point why it's justified, they talked about how these conditions will help. And they said that they limited it to being like conditions of medical aid, even though they then gave us examples. No, thank you. Even though they gave us examples of, for example, how America gave martial law, which is not a medical aid. This is like a structural aid, which doesn't really imply in this case. No, thank you. And also they gave us the fact that they, you know, that they should like. We should blame the governments in these countries if they abuse the rights. They said that, you know, it's not America's fault, it's not the Western countries' fault if we don't give them aid and this is still happening. Well, essentially this is like conceding the whole idea that this is going to change. So they said that, well, thank you. They said that if they abuse these rights still, even if they have it in the legislature, and even if this is going to happen, we still don't think that they should give them aid. We still don't think, apparently, at side proposition that we should help these people who are starving. We should just not give them aid because we think this is going to help, even though they essentially asserted that these people are scapegoated in society and that, you know, they're already not getting aid. They said that they're not getting aid in the first place, which doesn't make any sense because they didn't really substantiate it. They didn't say why they weren't getting this aid in the first place. They just asserted or like assumed that they aren't getting this aid. They didn't tell us really why they aren't getting the aid. And also the fact that they're economically dependent. They said that if they make this thing legal, if they like, for example, have this like formal legislative thing, they said that this is going to help. This is going to like at least provide some sort of benefit to the gay community. Well, we say if there's still a public opinion on gays, you know, not being, for example, like if there's still a very extreme hatred towards gays, we still think that this isn't, the legislature isn't going to affect that. We still think that if people hate gays, even if policemen hate gays, they don't really care about what the legislator says, what the Constitution says, because, you know, they still hate gays, and that's not going to stop. Before I move on to my contentions, yes, please.
We're not forcing these people to suddenly like and love gay people. We're saying that because you put this in legislature, you force the government to give them legal backing so they can hold them accountable if they don't fulfill this.
Well, the problem is, if people hate them anyway, it's okay, and we do agree that it's a good thing that if it was in the Constitution, well, we simply say that this isn't really enough. This isn't something that we should like base our whole premise of helping the gay community on, because it's not going to help if all these people aren't educated enough to think that, you know, to know that this is a bad thing, to know that hating gays isn't necessarily the way to go because they're uneducated and don't have that tolerance. No, thank you. And moving on to my first point about the purpose of aid. Well, we see that there are people in need, which is my first sub-point, that people should be helped regardless of, regardless of their situation. Because, well, when people are suffering, when people are starving, we think that regardless of what happens in those countries, regardless of what goes around them, we see that if we have an obligation to help. This is the purpose of why we give aid. We give aid to people who are in need of it. We don't have any stakes in it. We don't say because you have this political view, you're not going to get our aid because we don't agree with you. No, thank you. Because that you have these ideas of like societal values and that kind of thing. We don't think this should be a condition for giving aid. The only condition for giving aid should be whether or not you are suffering enough for us to have an obligation to help you, which is why we think this is outright stupid. No, thank you, because like saying that somehow we shouldn't help these people in need because that there are things going on in this country about gay rights being abused, somehow is like a reasoning behind not giving aid. This doesn't make any sense if people are suffering in this country. No, thank you. And the second sub-point on why is it wrong to not give aid? Well, we see that if we don't give aid, people will be suffering. Well, we see that if we do not give aid, no thank you, if we do not give aid to these countries, well, the quality of life of these people will diminish completely. They won't get the educational aid, they won't get all these things that might benefit them and like help them become like working, functioning people in that society. We think that if we just abandon them, that situation is going to become a lot worse. We also think that the change, no thank you, in behavior, in the way of like giving aid in the future is going to change because of that. Because if we start making conditions up for like why we give aid, we think this is like a bad thing. We think that if we start doing this, well, what stops us from like taking the next step and saying like, well, we don't agree with this. This is not in our societal value. Why should we give you aid? We shouldn't have, thank you, any political stakes in that sense. Moving on to my second argument about forcing change won't work. One of the first sub-point that I have is that resentment towards Western countries, or at least the ideals that they're proposing. So we think that is to that if we say to these people that we're not going to give you aid unless you accept the gay community, we think that they're going to resent not only the Western countries but also the message that they're sending. We think they're going to resent the fact that they, in order to receive aid, they're going to have to live up to these conditions. We think this is inherently wrong because, no thank you, it's not going to help anything if we just tell people that in order for you to accept these in order for you to get this aid, you're going to have to accept you're going to have to comply to the reasons we have behind this. Thank you. And also we think that it's the wrong incentive because essentially we'll be saying that we're not going in this country, we're not going to help you, we're not going to do all these things, we're just going to like cut off all our aid and this is it. For example, why shouldn't we then go into this country and help them with educational aid, teach them about tolerance of this gay community that they're actually trying to help? Well, does it help the gay community that we're not teaching people how these things work, teach them about sexuality and all these things? Because like, what if we don't do that? And even if we don't do that, going on to my second sub-point B, it's going to harm the gay community. And why is it going to harm the gay community? Well, we think that if a nation is told, if you do not comply to these conditions that we have, that you must accept gay people, these gay people will be scapegoated in society. Well, because that they'll be like now blamed for the fact that if they do not comply, they'll get no aid. And if they don't get the aid, well, it's going to fall on the gay community. They will be scapegoated and no tolerance will be taught. So in the future, they'll have no reason why not to hate the gay, why should we not hate the gay community? Because they're the reason behind why we didn't get this aid. So because of all these reasons, because that their point doesn't stand, we beg you to oppose.
Thank you very much for the speech. Now I'd like to welcome the second speaker on the government side to further expand on their arguments.
Proposition tells you that there's still unrebutted analysis from proposition side, where we showed you that because of the self-interest that society has, because they're put in a position where they would actually starve, ladies and gentlemen, they would actually compromise the sort of views that they would have towards the homosexual society just to assure that they actually get something within inside their stomachs. We see that a lot of the analysis hasn't been dealt with, but nonetheless, we'll actually deal with a lot of the matters that actually come up from side opposition, and we'll look at that within reconstruction as well as rebuttal. So now we get into reconstruction. Today we have two issues under this. This idea of efficacy as well as this idea of the types of aid and whether or not it's actually applicable within the developing world. So now let's deal with this idea of efficacy. See, we get this analysis about people on the ground and the fact that they tell us that people will continuously be harmed on the ground because if government is reluctant to change, then people on the ground will continue to receive these very harms and they will not develop and they will not move forward. We have one simple response to this. We tell you that once you actually have people on the ground that continue to feel these harms and they understand the reason why they do so, they tell you that they actually make a calculus. What does this mean? And it means that they actually have a cost-benefit analysis. So we see that within themselves, they would tell themselves that they would actually compromise sort of behavior that they would have so that they can actually receive this aid, which is something that's actually inherently important to the people on the ground. But then secondly, we look at this idea of culture and they tell us that they will not change their culture because culture is something that's inherently dear to them, not taken. We say that firstly, culture is not stagnant. Culture does change so that they can actually reach some sort of conformities. For example, we look at South African traditional circumcision. We see that the circumcision and the surgical procedure actually allows for doctors to perform it, but the camp still continues, so that the culture is still upheld, but there is some changes to accommodate the harms that exist. We still feel that that very principle actually applies within today's debate, because one, you would actually not necessarily like gays, but tolerate them and don't attack them, because the laws that exist already justify its very attacks. But then secondly, that in order to receive that very aid, you would actually accommodate them within your society. Not saying it. But also the idea they came up with types of aid, and they tell us that we actually specified medication, medical health care, and the fact that this aid will actually be held back. We tell you that this is false and we do not specify this. We show you that we actually have two sorts, which is financial aid, as well as the basic necessities that they actually receive on the ground. We don't think how that actually applies. But now let's look at this idea of rebuttal, right? And then there's a couple of ideas here. We see this firstly, the idea of purpose of aid. Secondly, people actually continuously harming people on the ground. The nature of aid itself, low standards of life, and lastly, resentment towards the West. So now let's get into this first issue and on the purpose of aid. So here they tell us that because purpose of aid is actually missed by us, and the fact that people on the ground don't get as much aid as they should be receiving. What we tell you under this is that already under status quo, a lot of the people don't receive the aid that should be receiving the aid. We tell you that families of these homosexuals don't actually receive this very aid. We actually gave you clearly analysis as to how this actually happened. We showed you that under this very analysis, ladies and gentlemen, that people within these countries like Angola, like Zambia, these kind of homosexual laws, they actually criminalize homosexuality within and of itself. So it's that they deprive these people of this very aid, so which means that the people that they actually have to take care of, as well as themselves, don't receive an effective amount of aid because it's actually criminalized, because they deprive them of it, and because it's actually shunned upon. So we don't think that actually works, we don't think that it actually works. Not take it. Then there's this idea of society continuously harming the homosexuals. What we tell you here is that people on the ground will actually tolerate them. Why does this actually happen? Because we've received analysis from this side that people actually do value this aid and it's actually dear to them. What we tell you here is because of that very reason, in order to actually receive something that's actually dear to them, we tell you that they don't actually sleep in bed together, but they actually tolerate them. And we tell you that once they have legal backing, what happens here is that once these criminal activity actually happens to these homosexuals, the people that harm them can be held accountable, which is different from status quo, quo where these laws exist and they're not held accountable simply because the law tells them that being homosexual and homosexuality in and of itself is actually a criminal act and it's criminal activity. We said that's the difference that happens with side government. But then we look at this idea of lower standards of life, where they kept on telling us that we actually further purport the terrible conditions that exist on the ground. What we tell you here, ladies and gentlemen, is that these people actually have a sense of self-interest. And within this self-interest, what happens here is that they do what's best for their own survival. So then we think that people on the ground have that way of, what do I do in order to actually become a better person? Do I throw a rock at that gay person, or do I actually leave him alone so that I can actually receive some sort of better aid so that I can benefit my family? We think that that very analysis happens on the ground, and once that actually inherently happens, it benefits the homosexuals on the ground because they don't get harmed as much as they do within status quo. And even if they do get harmed, the people who actually throw that rock at that person's head actually gets that very trial and actually gets held accountable. But then lastly, this idea of resentment to the West. Here they tell us that, okay, people with these conditions, people on the ground inherently hate the West and the fact that they wouldn't take into account what the West would do. But then the solution that they give us here as an alternative is the fact that they should educate them about homosexuality and that Western principles actually do uphold. We say that that's a contradiction because they tell us that that resentment to the West is likely to happen when there is conditions, but it will not happen once you tell them that their culture is wrong. We don't think that, we think that in and of itself, that's a contradiction because they told us that they value that culture, they value that culture, but moreover, that once they actually tell them that it's wrong, it actually becomes a harm. But now let me get into my issue of contention. And here we look at the harms. Here we look at the harms on the ground and how it's actually far worse once you ignore this very condition or within aid. We see that the aims of aid, we see that there are actually two aims of aid and how it's actually bettered on side proposition. We see that firstly, they need to ensure that it's fairly distributed, and secondly, beyond its distribution, that it should be used effectively. Why is ignoring this very condition and how ignoring anti-homosexual laws actually hinder this? Let's take a look at this. We then tell you that the reason why specifically gay laws are actually hindering this very progress and actually hindering this very proper conditional aid, because we tell you one, I'll take within a moment, we tell you that one, because of the existing laws, it actually justifies the attacks that happened on the ground. But before I further analyze that, yes sir?
If I threatened you with starvation until you accepted me, would you still do so if you at some point could suddenly provide for yourself?
Well, the thing here is that if you threaten me with starvation on the condition that I need to tolerate another person for their sexual orientation, we tell you that the way up here, because I need the aid, I'm likely to take that aid simply because what happens here is that it's quite simple. I just need to tolerate that very person. So what we see is that even if they are threatened with that very starvation, they're likely to deal with that very circumstance so that they can actually receive that aid. So now, looking here, we look at how it actually justifies these attacks. What we tell you is that the very society in and of themselves, within their culture, they largely value their views towards how they actually see homosexuals. And what we tell you is that a large external influence that has that amount of power can actually incentivize that sort of change because it's basic necessities that they need to actually move from one day to the next. We think that it's because something's so dear to them, they can actually move off and actually tolerate these gay people. What does this mean? They bring up, we see that we've gotten a large amount of analysis from the side that inherently tells us that they will not accept them and they will further harm them. We tell you that in status quo they're already being harmed, but here what the difference is, they have legal backing, but moreover, ladies and gentlemen, that within that very tolerance, these homosexuals themselves are actually being protected by that very law. But then we see that these two aims are actually largely defeated once you actually ignore this, because one, distribution hardly happens because the rightful amount of people, the rightful amount of homosexuals that actually need this don't receive it. But secondly, we tell you that the aid given to the people are actively harmed. We tell you that because it's criminalized and because aid is given, even if it actually goes out to those very homosexuals, we tell you that they receive aid and they still become harmed. So that means that that aid itself is not really as effective as it should have been because it goes to a place that always will become harmed. That means that that very aid will constantly be needed and not just on a one-time basis. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that self-interest is important and opposition and side proposition takes this.
Thank you very much for the speech. Now I'd like to welcome the second speaker on the opposition side to further expand on their arguments. There's papers behind you, right behind you.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem.
Are we good?
Yep.
Development and progress. That is what we want to see, and that is what we're going to help with. But we need to start from the bottom, work our way up, and create a sustainable foundation for the progress. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is done with enlightenment, not with force and threats. So, before I get into my constructive argument about how development promotes tolerance, I will be getting into a bit of rebuttal and reconstruction. So, first of all, some reconstruction of my first speaker's points. So he had 2 points. Firstly, about the purpose of aid. He talked about how people's well-being should be the first priority, and side proposition's response to this was that sure it should, but the gays are the ones that have problems now. But what we say, and what we also ask in a POI, is that how can you promote gay acceptance over the people in need? What we see is that we need to keep in mind that the gay is a minority. It is a minority of people, and if we suddenly take the aid, it is not. It does not make moral sense to take the aid, no thank you, away from the majority in order to help the minority. We need to help the minority, we accept that, but we do not believe that side proposition's way is the right, no thank you, which I will get more into. Also, we had this idea of how forcing change won't work. They will reset the message because that suddenly their lives, their hunger, their food is conditioned on them tolerating these people, no thank you. And if suddenly someone tells you to tolerate someone or you won't get food, then what will basically happen is that you will go up to the stand, say, yeah, I tolerate these people, get your food, and then you will then we don't believe that your actual beliefs will actually change in any ways. So no, thank you. Their response to this was that they mischaracterized our argument. They said that it was because that we say that they hold their culture dear, that they want change. And then they followed up by saying culture does change, but what they didn't attack was our logic of how resentment comes from when you try to impose your message on someone. No, thank you. So we believe that this point still stands strongly because we've seen no actual rebuttal on this. So on to some rebuttal of what side proposition has said. So they had this point. They have had 2 points about basically the same thing. Their second point about the practical effects of this, and their third point about the harms on the ground. So what this point was about was that basically something is wrong, our motion will change this, and their only real benefit, their only real change that they could make was that they will actually change their constitution, change their laws. No, thank you. So that they to meet the requirements for this, because this need is necessary, or this aid is necessary for the countries. Okay, we agree they might change the laws, but that will not change the status in the country, because what we see is that, first of all, we see that in many developing countries they have very weak judiciary systems. We do not believe that they can actually uphold this this legal change. No, thank you. We see that, for example, even in India, which is a BRIC country, they have been having huge development. They still have problems with enforcing. With enforcing rape, with enforcing things other things that discriminate women. We see that in many developing countries they do have issues with enforcing these things, and therefore we believe that their benefit does not actually stand in opposition to ours, or to our harm. No, thank you. So what we're saying is that if it doesn't practically change, then it doesn't matter. That was what they said in their first speech. That if A motion is hollow if it doesn't practically change anything. We believe that that is their most important burden, and we believe that they have not been able to prove that at all yet, because their own real benefit, or their only real change, is the legal system. So,
Okay, sir.
no, thank you. Also, we asked them in a POI in their second speech. So, if someone made you starve until if someone made him starve until he accepted me, would you then all still accept him after he could suddenly provide for himself? His answer was that yes, he would tolerate me while I gave him the food. No, thank you. And then he did, and then he had no comment for the long-term thing. We believe that it is the same thing with this motion. If you condition, no, thank you. If you condition food on tolerance, you will also. You condition food on tolerance as soon as they develop into a state where they can provide for themselves. You will still. They will no longer. No, sit down. They will no longer believe in this message. If you don't teach them why they should believe in this message, then they will simply discard it as soon as. We have heard no analysis on why they would actually keep on believing in the notion that gays are proper human beings, that they should be respected, even after even after they can provide for themselves. Before I go on to my contention, yes, please.
We've seen it a lot of times when people hate each other, but when law is enforced, for example in America, with desegregation of education, the time period of that tolerance causes them to accept it eventually.
Okay, thank you very much. So what she's basically saying is that when you make a legal change, sometime in the future there will be a change in the mentality as well. We do not believe that they can in any way prove this. They can in any way guarantee this. What we see is that in the short term, we believe that there will be definite harms. People will resent or scapegoat the gays for preventing them of their food because they already don't understand or sympathize with the gays, and we believe that in the short term this is an issue, and if they can prove and guarantee that in the future there will be in the future there will be that they will suddenly tolerate them because of the legal change in the beginning with the weak judiciary systems, then their point might stand. Okay, so my contention about how development promotes tolerance. So first of all, what we see in many developing nations is that there is a severe lack of education. So who in developing nations are not actually educated? What we see is that in many cases it's actually the majority, but it's mostly also in rural areas. We see the part that are disconnected with the city. What we see is that this leads to a lot of common misunderstandings with the gays. We see that it's a disease, or it's a choice. They choose to be this disgusting kind of people. Now, how does education actually clear this up? So knowing that, for example, knowing that it is biological, as we do in the Western world, does make a huge change. It means that it's not a disease, it's not something that you can contract, and knowing that it is simply biological, not a choice, it does promote understanding. And also we see that in the Western world, we teach tolerance by giving perspective. So during school, we show movies about homosexuals. We teach the children about perspective. We teach the children about homosexuals. Therefore, we teach tolerance so that we in the Western world actually tolerate them, accept them, instead of just saying that we tolerate them in order to get our next meal. So also we see that in many developing nations there is a dominance of religion. We see that. So why does religion actually have a say in developing nations? We believe that there is a lot of desperation. We believe that a lot of the people want to have a meaning in their lives. We believe that this is a tendency that we see in it's protected time. Sit down. We believe that in many nations, or in desperate times of desperation, people have a tendency to seek religion. Why is this actually bad? We see that even in the Western world, churches, religions actually promote resentment towards homosexuals. We see that for example, in USA, we see the Baptist churches. They oppose gay marriages. They oppose there are even churches that want to lynch gay people. And we see that if it can happen in the Western world, it can definitely happen in the developing world. We even see in Uganda, where the church has made impressive lobbying work where that caused anti-gay laws in many cases. So what have I told you here today? I told you that the only benefit that side proposition could actually prove was that there will be legal changes, and I have proven to you why that doesn't stand, and that is why I am proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the speech. Now I'd like to welcome the third speaker on the government side to deliver the rebuttal.
What we haven't received from side opposition thus far in this debate is how there's an intrinsic harm and how we exacerbate the situation in status quo when we tell you that we will not give you aid unless you help everyone within your country, including minorities which are currently being oppressed, like your gay people, like your lesbians, like your transgendered people. So what we didn't get is how we continue to harm those people further than they being harmed in status quo. All they told you was that we're never going to accept these people. And here we tell you that we didn't say that we want these people to be accepted. We said they want them to be tolerated. There's a fine line between the two things, and there's a difference, and I'll show you later within my speech. I'll analyze it using two questions. The first question is, which side better shows the extent to which Western nations should make their aid conditional on this, right? The second question here is, do we actually achieve any significant benefits in the long run? So let's go into the central question here, which is, should we actually allow Western nations to conditionalize on this, right? And here the first idea we received was that of the purpose of aid. So the main idea we received here is that we give aid to people who actually need this. But the further analysis here was that aid should only be conditionalized on whether or not you're actually suffering or how much you actually suffer in your country, right? Three responses. We tell you that firstly, this isn't true because the majority of times countries from the West give aid is because they already have interest in your borders. We think America invests in countries like Nigeria for their oil to benefit themselves, despite the fact that they have anti-gay laws in Nigeria. What we didn't see is analysis on how we then shouldn't push them to actually accept what America stands for, which is gay rights and acceptance or tolerance of these gay people in the long run. What we didn't see is why there's a harm when this actually happens, right? Not taken set. Second response to this, and we tell you here that this was an implicit concession that there already is conditions on aid in the first place, right? We tell you here that when you offer aid, it's based on things like they said, whether or not you're suffering. So we didn't understand why in the second idea they had to tell us that unconditional aid is actually unjustified, but I'll deal with this later. So they tell us here that you actually shouldn't conditionalize aid. We tell you that this already exists, but why can't we push them further? Why can't we add this one condition, especially if it protects everyone and if it ensures that everyone actually gets this aid and it's widespread and everyone is protected within that country, especially in legal backing, which my first speaker told you about, and responded to analysis on how she told you that when you have legal backing and when you enshrine these rights within the Constitution, you have formal change. What that means is that when you actually violate the rights of these people, they have the right to hold the government accountable if that very government cannot protect them. They have the right to actually ensure or force that government to protect them in any circumstance against those very communities that abuse them in the first place. What we didn't get is why this is wrong. Why don't we get to force the government to fulfill their mandate to even protect the very minorities in these very countries, right? We think even if this wasn't true, the fact that we achieved the marginal benefit of actually enforcing this and actually making it legal in these countries means we win this debate because they couldn't show that it's harmful to these people, right? And all they could say was that we harm people on the ground, right? So that response here would say that even these very gay people and these transgendered people are suffering in these countries, we'd say that is an implicit concession that we should give them this aid in the first place. We think that is a contradiction from their half, because they tell us that we only give aid based on how much you're suffering and based how much your people are actually suffering. We tell you here that even when minorities suffer, then we should give that aid because we protect them and we develop them in the long run, right? What we didn't get is how this legal protection is actually harmful, how this legal aid will not work, and how these people will continue not to be protected and to be abused in the status quo, right? But all they could tell us was that these countries have weak judicial systems. And there's only one response to this, and that is what my first speaker told you on how aid is not only based on finances and based on food packages, but it's based on things like human resources as well. What we didn't see is how these Western countries don't come to offer things like training and don't come to offer things like human resources in these very countries. We think if they had weak judicial systems, then that can be fixed in order to accommodate these very people in these countries. We don't see how that's harmful. We think, in fact, you better their systems when you force them to actually have these conditions, because you then allow them to better their judicial system as well. We add an added benefit to their case, right? But before I continue, yes, sir.
How will these judiciary systems ever reach the rural areas where the problems are most?
So their problem is that they want to base this in rural areas, and that is what their case was majorly based on. We tell you here that it's not only rural areas which are affected in this motion, but we tell you that even if, right, we don't see how there's no form of mechanisms to hold the government accountable in these very rural areas. What they didn't give you is mechanistic analysis on how the people in these very rural areas are unable to hold these very governments accountable. We don't think that stands, right? But the second idea they tell us here is that unconditional aid is actually unjustified. We told you that this already exists in these countries. We think the fact that they base their aid on whether or not you're suffering, like they said, is already a condition. So what they meant then was that we shouldn't base our aid on anything, and we shouldn't base it on whether or not your country has human rights abuses. We think you contradict the aims of this aid in the first place, because if we do this, then it means that we give it to you whether or not you violate the rights of your own citizens. What that means is that we condone the very violence that's happening in these countries, but we further propagate it because we then don't base it on those very human rights, and we don't use the comparative advantage on how these very countries are dependent economically on these very Western countries, and therefore they have enough influence to actually bring change in these very countries, right? We don't think that stands. But let's go on to whether or not we achieve significant benefits in the long run. And here they tell us that the solution is to actually educate these people, right? And we think this was a contradiction, especially since they told us that when you force change, you actually further anger these people. And I'll show you here how you further anger them when you actually try to educate them, right? First response, we'd say this was a contradiction, especially since they told us that these countries don't have enough, they have such a significant lack of education. But then we tell you that education in and of itself is a way of actually enforcing those very Western ideals that they don't want these to be implemented in these very countries. So what do? You actually enforce these very Western ideals. These people get further angered. But second response to this, we'd say that education only teaches you to accept these people and not to tolerate them. What that means is that you're trying to enforce them and you're trying to force them to accept these people. What we do in our policy, we tell you here that you have your own free will and you don't have to accept them, you don't have to love them, you just have to tolerate them, and you don't have to abuse them. We actually tell you that when you abuse these very people, you're held accountable by the legal system. What they do is that they force these people and they enforce Western ideals on these people. But we tell you that you further anger them when you try to enforce these ideals, because it's not what they want to stand for, it's not what they value. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why we want to base conditional aid on acceptance on gay rights, and that is why we propose this motion.
Thank you very much for the speech, and I would like to welcome the last speaker of the opposition sides to deliver their rebuttals.
Madam Speaker, in this debate, we've seen a side proposition that is focused solely on the legal system, and has had this narrow-minded approach that basically says that if we can change the legal system in this country to accept gays, then we're going to cause most of the problems which gays face to go away. And we think that just because they focused most of the case on this doesn't necessarily mean that that they proved it, or B, that this is the only thing that matters in the debate. So, before I go on to my, so this means that I'm going to look at this debate in three different clashes. First of all, the justification for aid. Second of all, what legal change we'll see. And thirdly, what societal change we will see. So now, on to my first clash about the justification for aid. The first proposition speaker came up here and told us a number of different reasons about why aid is always conditional and must be conditional. Some of these reasons were examples of, for example, IMF aid or the Marshall Plan aid. But we tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that this aid is not conditional based off different societal values or political ideas. It's conditioned based off of effectiveness. For example, Marshall Plan aid. No, thank you. Marshall Plan aid was dependent on whether or not, it could be seen whether the aid was going to something useful or just being pocketed for themselves. So, no, thank you. So we don't think that they've exactly shown us why. Please be quiet. We don't exactly think that they've shown us why it is why this is an acceptable justification for forcing the societal value on these countries. We also said that we don't that basically it's that aid is a choice and that countries don't have to give aid to these to each other if they don't want to. But we say that although this may be the case in practice, we don't think this is the way it should be. We think that it's not exactly. We think that the point of aid is that we're going to help other people no matter where they come from, no matter what they think, no matter what they do, because they need help. And although unfortunately, no thank you. Unfortunately, there's been many different instances where people have chosen not to give aid because of practical matters, such as not having enough money to give for aid. We don't think that this means that we should give up on people just because we don't feel like it. We don't. No, thank you. We don't. We also said that. We said to you that because of the obligation which countries have to everyone else in need, and because it's wrong not to give the aid to these people that depend on it, just because of where they're born, just because of other circumstances which are out of their control, like for example being gay. We don't think that they've
Please, sir.
We don't think that there's a good enough reason for us to for them to tell us that we should not give aid to these people if they still need it. We think that this is a very important point. We don't think that we think that they told us that they basically just asserted that under the status quo, since gay people, as we pointed out, a minority, can't get aid, then it's perfectly fine for us to not give aid to anyone else in the country until they're willing to help us, until they're willing to help them out with it. No, thank you. We don't think that they've. We don't think this is true for a couple of reasons. First of all, we think that under the status quo, they've completely that gay people are still able to get aid. We don't think that it's very easy for them if they're out of the closet, but we do think that it's possible for them and their families to get aid. We think that that this. No, thank you. We don't think that they've really shown us why this is going to be the case. They just mostly asserted it. So another thing that we've also told you is that. Okay, we basically told you and shown you throughout this debate that through a number of POIs, such as asking them whether it's okay for other people to suffer, even if they don't have the political influence to make the changes to the legal system, just so that way people in the Western countries can feel good about not supporting people that don't necessarily like gays. So we think that we win on the point of justification for aid. We don't think that it's justified to cut off aid just because there's a tendency in this country to not like gay people and to go after them, because there is still a need and there are still people which need our help. Okay, now on to the legal change. This is essentially where most of their case focused. Basically, most of their focus was about how if we get laws enshrined into the Constitution or other different things, basically this means that all the gay problems which gay people face will eventually go away. Well, first of all, ignoring the practical issues of actually getting these laws passed when it's exceedingly unpopular in the country, we think that there's a number of different issues with this. We've pointed out to you, for example, that there's actually no motivation for these these countries to keep these laws in place if once they don't need aid anymore, once they become developed enough that they don't rely on aid. We think that their response to this was just that, okay, if it's a legal change in the system, if there's a legal change, then no thank you. We think that they said that if there's a legal change and it's in place for long enough, that culture will change around it. But we don't think that'll happen for a couple of reasons. First of all, developing countries do have quite a decent bit of corruption in it, and that means that thank you. That means that especially with unpopular laws which are being forced upon them from the outside, people are not going to be inclined to enforce them either as judges, juries, or policemen because they're part of the society. No thank you, which are against gays. And although they may have although they may have passed this law and they may stand on the papers, it's not going to affect the actual what's actually happening on the streets. And because people aren't actually going to be held very much accountable in very many cases, especially out in rural areas where we think a lot of this debate takes place, although not all of it, we think that basically this means that because even if the laws are going to be on the books but ignored, if anything, it's going to further entrench the idea that gay people don't deserve to be treated equally. We don't think that they've shown us why the legal change, which is what most of the cases rested on, is actually going to change things on the ground. Because we've shown you essentially that the legal system in these developing countries is not always capable of dealing with the challenges of enforcing laws, especially not unpopular laws, which the vast majority of the population are against. And we don't think that they've proved this to us enough in order to win this debate on benefits. Before I go on, yes.
So assuming that you say the judicial system is not capable, what if we told you because aid is about humanitarian aid and human resources like soldiers when the military is incapable, we take judges, we train people, we build more infrastructure.
Thank you very much
What's
for that.
wrong with
Thank
that?
you very much. We think that development aid is necessary, and we don't think that we're stopping that. We think that yes, once the judicial system is we think that we're definitely in support of fulfilling the judicial system, but we don't see why. No, thank you. I'm still answering your POI. I don't see why it is. We don't see exactly why it is that it's impossible for us to develop the judicial system when we're giving them aid. We think that's what we're doing. We think that eventually, I'm going to move on to societal change in a second now and explain to you how once societal change takes place and once these countries are developed, we will be able to see gay rights take progress. So let me get into that right now. Okay, so about societal change, we've basically told you that essentially gay people are very misunderstood because people have all these incredibly strange notions about gay people, that being gay is a disease. And we've told you that the way to fight this is with education. Now, they essentially just had one response to this, and that was that, okay, education is just a Western tool of imposing their will. And although we don't think that's the case, because we think that you can educate someone, but they can make up their own mind about it, we do think that effectively these people who are being educated are going to be are not going to feel like it's being forced upon them. The resentment to Western nations, to Western ideals, to the idea that they don't have a choice and that they must accept gay people is going to leave them more open-minded and more willing to accept change. We also think that by leaving development aid on there, that we're going to take people out of poverty, out of desperation. They're not going to want to scapegoat people. They're not going to like minorities. They're not going to want to lash out in anger at their situation. They're going to be willing to live with people with a more open mind, and eventually the judicial system will be at a certain stage, once they're not relying on development aid for the very survival of themselves, that they can maybe think about passing laws when their countries are ready to do that, when they will actually make a difference, when they will actually improve things for gay people in the country. Because ultimately in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that that it's come down to whether or not this motion will actually help gay people. And we think that not only have we shown you on our side of the house in opposition that it will not help gay people, because simply putting a law on the books doesn't change things on the ground. It doesn't change things in the minds and hearts of people, that it will not change things for the better for gay people. It'll only make things worse, and it's wrong to do so and to sacrifice other people and their well-being just so that the Western world can feel better about not giving aid to a country which has some ideas that they don't agree with. So for all these reasons, we beg you to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the speech. Now I'd like to welcome the reply speaker on the opposition side to conclude this debate for their side.
imposement of values versus corroboration, as unrealistic world versus unrealistic world. What we see is that side proposition has tried to make a case where they will impose the values and suddenly they will start tolerating them and consequently accept them. What we see on side opposition is a case where we try to promote acceptance as we have seen it work before, the only way we know that this might actually happen. So, this debate I will try to characterize through three main questions. So first of all, how should we approach the notion of aid? Second of all, what will be the effects of conditioning aid? And secondly, what should actually be the end goal and which side should you therefore go with? So, first of all, how should we approach the notion of aid? Or how does the sides actually talk about the approachment of aid? So side proposition says that we should approach aid with conditions. This will make benefits, and we should condition our aid so that we force them into doing the things that we want them and we think that they should do. What side opposition thinks is that the notion of aid should solely be to help. It should be to help the nations develop, to help the people survive, and to prevent them from starvation and thirst. So, what these two sides are, a side proposition with an imposement of values. They try to impose values on the nations, whereas we try to corroborate with them. We try to say, we are helping you, we're also helping you with human resources, and therefore we can improve your judicial system, and therefore and maybe at some point we can also make some laws that would help the homosexuals as well. So next question, what will be the effects of actually conditioning this aid and of the two different worlds? So first of all, we see the side proposition says that there will be a judicial change. We do not contest that. Then there will be accountability. Then there will be tolerance. And then we say this tolerance will then go away after they can suddenly provide for themselves. So what we also see is inherently weak about this chain of logic is that they have not responded substantially to the notion of the weak judiciary systems. Like, we have a problem with judiciary systems that are heavily influenced by the church, that can't always reach into the rural areas, and we see that their notion of relying solely on the judicial system and how that will and for them to make a change in the nation is simply a weak point. What we inside opposition's world, without conditioning this aid, we see that we believe that we will experience more development because they will not be forced to keep trying to get ready for the next deadline so that they meet the conditions. There will be more development. Therefore comes education with development. As I told you in my second speech, education leads acceptance. So what we see is that we believe that in side opposition's world, we will gain acceptance. What we see inside opposition's world is we will only gain momentary tolerance. So, what should be the end goal? What we see is that side opposition or side proposition believe that we should only that it is okay that we should only tolerate them for a short term. They believe that the short term fix is the best fix because that they're in need now, and we just need to help them right now. And we believe on side opposition that first of all, this will not help all the homosexuals in the developing world, but secondly, we believe that we should always aim and go. We should always aim for acceptance. Aim for the long-term solution. If a nation, if a culture accepts homosexuals, we believe that there will never be any issues again. Not even if they suddenly can supply for themselves. And on these grounds, I am proud to oppose. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the speech. Now, finally, I would like to welcome the reply speaker on the government side to conclude this debate as a whole.
We hope for acceptance in Rwanda, we got a genocide. We hope for acceptance in Germany, we got a Holocaust. How many more people have to die before there's actual change? We think organic change and a little bit of education takes too long and too many lives are lost in the process. I'll analyze this debate using two simple questions for you. Firstly, does the West have the mandate? Secondly, can they conditionalize? And lastly, does it work? Right? And the first idea here that we're going to deal with is, does the West have the mandate? And here in my speech, I gave you a very good question, right, which they still haven't answered. The West has basic mandates to its people and then other people after. People and countries have a mandate to the people of their countries. We told you that conditional aid and aid is just a favor. They needed to tell us that in order for the West to be a good government or to be a good region, they have to give aid in order to assure stability in other countries. They needed to show us that this was a mandate, this was a responsibility, and this had to be done. So I told you that all the harms that they mentioned, why can't we blame all of these harms on the governments of these countries? Because they are the ones that have the sovereign rule and are in full control. Why should it be the West when the West has the sovereign responsibility for its people and no one else? That wasn't answered. But secondly, we told you that aid has always been conditionalized. This is an extra criteria. They didn't tell us why the specific criteria is wrong. The only thing they rebutted out of my 7 levels is that the Marshall Plan was based on effectiveness. No, clearly someone doesn't do history. Marshall aid was based on 2 ideologies, communism and capitalism. They still haven't dealt with the principle point of why countries have the right to conditionalize, of how it's been history to conditionalize aid, and it's still justified. Let's go to the real matter. Will it work? So they tell us here that the judicial systems in these countries are very weak, and let's wait for a little more time so they develop it, right? So we told you one response, that firstly, when you give aid, it can include human resources. That's why when America sends military to a certain country, because the military there is weak, that in itself is a form of human resource. We asked them, what is stopping us from giving them proper judges, bettering their infrastructure, because that in itself is development aid, and making the judiciary system a little stronger? We got no response. But what we did get from the 3rd speech is, why don't we do that first and then deal with the problems after? The reason here is you develop the elites and you don't give them the reason to love or to care about the minority. When you conditionalize their survival, you force them to tolerate the minority first and then allow them to develop together. We just didn't get why this wouldn't work. But then they tell us that government is going to take time to accept this. I gave you very good analysis on how if your economy is dependent on something, you're bound to prioritize that. If 85% of your economy depends on development aid, you will make sure that you change laws. You will make sure that you change these things. But lastly, principally placed, we don't think Rome was built in a day. And we don't think these gay people are suddenly going to be in love with everybody else. But we do think it changes the mentality of these individuals. It changes the way they see things. And that in itself creates social change. Social justice takes time, but social change can be instant. And they didn't tell us why we don't achieve that marginal benefit. We're still waiting for that. But then lastly, they tell you that education. This is quite contradictory because they say these people are so culturally enshrined and they hate the West. If that's the case, how are they going to accept your education? But assuming that our judicial system doesn't work, what makes your education system better? Because if it's a bad judiciary system, it means it's a bad healthcare, it's a bad educational system. So where do you teach these people? How do you accommodate the teaching? We think if your mechanism can work, then we can certainly better the judicial system and make this policy work as well. Secondly, will there be a backlash? And here they tell us that development equals care and love and tolerance. And here we tell you this is not true. In order for black people to be accepted in America, we needed things like black power. We needed things like motivation and activists to move. We don't think government just changed because of development. We think there's a need and there's an incentive for the people to change their mentalities. There's an incentive for government to change their mentalities. But lastly, why shouldn't gay rights be the condition? Because the nature of aid is conditionalized in itself. They still haven't answered this question. Thank you.